You ever wonder about architecture? I think about it sometimes, but mostly I just treat buildings like objects. A place to go, a place to sit, a place to do something. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the craft and artistry that has gone into the buildings around me. I live in Winnipeg. It's a small city in the middle of Canada. And recently I've gotten curious about the architecture in my city. So I think I want to explore it. I don't know much about architecture or Winnipeg's history, so I think I should talk to someone who does. This is Ted Landrum. He's a professor at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches architecture. If there's anybody who can tell me about Winnipeg's architecture, this is the guy. The first building we visited today was the Pavilion. Okay. At the Assiniboine Park. It is very remnant. It has sort of the exposed beams. You know, it has I guess it's that the Tudor style.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and it looks very much like I've seen houses like this before. I've seen other buildings like this. I think a lot of Parks Canada, sort of the little cabins where you like are signing in and stuff look like that. But at Assiniboine Park, it looks like a castle, a monumental version of that.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that kind of style of building?
Sure. I mean, partly there's a blend of the kind of rustic that's brought in to the landscaped garden.
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes almost like a folly, you know, where we take this authentic rustic thing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like an example would be the grotto, you know, is an extreme piece where it's really rough, cave-like. The origins of life come out of this grotto. Yeah. But it's placed in this wonderfully landscaped, you know, park environment that's a man-made nature. It's not nature. It's an artifice. But it gives expression to the desire for pure things, the desire for a kind of life that connects everybody, that this kind of common ground in nature. And so the pavilion, yeah, of course, the exposed timber, it does come from a certain period of history, but it's also a way of building. Yeah. And it's a way of building where you can see the connections. You can see the structure. Yeah. Or the efforts made to have the building stand up and to withstand centuries. Right?
Yeah. One of the other places that we visited was the legislature building, the Ledge, which, I mean, when you talk about pillars, when you talk about sort of taking a lot of those wooden structures and turning it into stone, then you see those sort of happening there. I've traveled and spent time in a lot of British cities around the world, you know, a lot of cities that were built sort of colonial cities, and you see sort of these banking districts and these sort of like, you know, with a lot more sort of columns and domes, etc. And the Ledge just seems like, again, a culmination of so many things.
Yeah. It is. I mean, there's an accrual. So it's just like with music, you know, there's a certain form that develops, and musicians, they hear other musicians, and people like to hear the same old song again. And repetition happens. So the same thing in architecture is an art form that's like that. It develops over time. So, in fact, some people do wrongly try to be innovative in an extreme way. That said, it's not like we can have one without the other.
Sure.
The great musicians have done a new version. They've made it a new twist onto something else. Rock and roll didn't come out of nowhere. Sure. Right? It came out of the blues. It came out of the street music, you know, and it came out of African American culture. And slave songs, you know, and it also came out of work songs, all of that. Like things don't come out of nothing. So it is a problem. It's one of my pet peeves, you could say, when precedents are not acknowledged. If I was an architectural historian, and I am not, I would be able to tell you what the precedent is for the pavilion, the park pavilion at Assiniboine Park, because there are many. And the legislative building, I mean, I think it's a more French, you know, tradition of the grand government building. And it goes back to royalty. And, you know, obviously the Queen's statue has been pulled down. Now the King's going to come along and replace it with a statue of himself.
Oh, wow.
So there is association with royalty. And the big house is the house of the monarch. you know, or the tyrant, whatever the case may be.
I haven't visited, but you did mention the St. Boniface Cathedral.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the St. Boniface Cathedral?
Well, again, it's a relational thing. So the Forks, which is the story of Winnipeg and maybe of Canada, you know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the meeting place for thousands of years will continue to be one. And it was colonized by the French first, and then the English. And so the French brought their Catholicism, you know, and that's part of that story. But today, what's amazing is the fire that happened in 1968 and the decision.
What happened?
That I don't know the cause. I think, if I remember right, they were repairing the roof, which is something that happened in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. You know, they were doing some mechanical work, some maintenance work, and you know, they do torch down membranes. It's bizarre that you use fire to make something waterproof. It's something alchemical about the way things are transformed. So you need fire to make to make it waterproof, and it causes a fire. But it did burn almost entirely, all the wood, you know, and the stone stands. And so here you have that allegory. It's standing there as a defiance of death in a way. And it lives on and has another life afterwards, you know. So anyway, you can read all these meta-narratives into the survival of a ruin.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is a very late copy of a Gothic cathedral.
Yeah.
And then it's on axis now with the Museum for Human Rights. Not exactly, but there's the pathway that has the statue of Gandhi on it.
Yes.
What a bizarre accretion of things. It's like a shish kebab where you have that cathedral on the one end, you have this path with Gaudi on it. You have the skate park, which is really important to the young people in the city.
Could you talk a bit about that? Another place we visited was the Human Rights Museum. Can you talk a bit about that building?
If you take a road trip across Canada, driving over Lake Superior is so beautiful. There are all these road cuts, they call them, where it cuts through the stone.
Yes.
And you get a little cross-section of the earth. And it's so beautiful. The trees, you're coming up a hill, then in order to soften the climb for the trucks, they decided to blast into the stone. And you drive through a section of the rocky mantle of the earth. And you see this geological history in cross-section, and it's very beautiful. So the road cut is one of his primary metaphors. So when you go to the Museum for Human Rights, you descend down. And it's like you're going down into archaeological history, and there should be an archaeological display at the ground floor that talks about how when they built that building, they did an archaeological expedition and they found something like 60,000 artifacts from pre-colonial times. So you go down into the earth, and this is Antoine Prédoc's primary gesture, is that you go down, and then there's this other tradition in architecture is called the axis mundi. And it's this vertical axis that goes from the heavens down to the core of the earth.
What does it all mean? Like, what is the shape of the Human Rights Museum?
Well, it's an organic thing. So the pieces that radiate out at the base, these are like road cut pieces, but they're also the roots. So it's the root. It's like the building is like a gigantic tree, Yggdrasil or something. You know, it's like the roots of a gigantic tree that's been severed. You know, because the story of human rights is like very incomplete. But maybe let's say it goes to the roots. One thing I like about Antoine Prédoc is he's not afraid of metaphors, and he's not afraid of bold imagery, and even iconography. You know, but it's a big story of architecture, and modern architecture in particular is the suppression of representation. You know, so like some of these buildings here, like the King's Head pub, you know, like there's a little bit of what we call ornament are really just the masonry details. It's the building itself that is the ornament. See? So he tried to make something which would be an ornament not only to the city of Winnipeg and not only to all of Canada, because it was the first federal museum outside of Ottawa. It's a big deal that they cited that museum. It's a national museum, and they sited it outside of Ottawa.
Yeah.
They put it in Winnipeg, of all places, and it's the center of the continent, center of Turtle Island.
Yeah.
And so that is gathering, those roots are radiating out of that center axis.
Yeah.
It's the top of which is the Tower of Hope. So all of those stories of this continent, but in fact, it's an international story. The story of human rights is not a local story. It's a global story. So all the stories of the world are gathered. That's a tremendous amount of force to do that. And they're pulled into that center space.
So I have just one last question for you. Why should people care about architecture?
You care for your body. Everyone must care for their body. Right? If you don't, things will not go well. Even I, trimmed my beard before coming this morning, But also it's about health of the human body and the human spirit. It's about dignity, right? So we don't walk around naked like every other animal. We put clothes on. And architecture is a bit like, I call it a group costume. That's one of my theories I came up with personally, But another way of putting it that sounds a little bit less strange for people is that it's the social body. Because we do have, obviously, we know a lot about the human body, the nose, the ear. There's all these pieces, and some are more meaningful to us than others. And we all look the same. We all have the same body parts, as a matter of fact, just about all. But somehow everyone is unique. So the same thing is true of the architectural body. And there's a long discourse in architectural theory and history about the architecture and body relationship. But the point I'm trying to make is the architecture of the city, definitely, is the social body. And if you say, well, we have individual bodies, but what is the social body? There is no definitive answer to that, right? There isn't an anatomy of the social body other than the history of architecture and cities. That is the social body.
I definitely take buildings for granted. I take architecture for granted. And this experience has really opened my eyes and made me realize that every building has a story. And it's just up to me to take the time to notice.